Let's take a trip to Vienna, late 1800s. Gas lamps flicker along narrow cobblestone streets, horse-drawn carriages pass quietly in the cold evening air. In a modest apartment, a physician sits surrounded by books, anatomical drawings, and ancient artifacts. His name is Sigmund Freud. At this time, mental illness is not treated through conversation. It is treated with restraints, with institutionalization, with speculation about weak moral character or nervous exhaustion. But Freud is beginning to notice something different. Patients, particularly women diagnosed with hysteria, present with paralysis, blindness, tremors, symptoms that have no identifiable medical causes, no tumors, no lesions, no physical injuries. Yet, the symptoms are real. Freud begins to ask a radical question. What if the body is speaking when the mind cannot? What if symptoms are not random but meaningful? In 1895, Freud and Joseph Brauer published studies on hysteria, introducing the idea that unconscious psychology conflicts can manifest physically. For the first time in Western medicine, the mind is positioned as the driver of symptoms. This moment marks the birth of psychoanalysis. And whether you love Freud or critique him, and we will do both today, you cannot understand the history of mental health without understanding this turning point. Freud did not just introduce new ideas, he changed how we conceptualized human behavior, symptoms, personality, and even the therapeutic relationship itself. Happy New Year! Yes, I know it is February, and I know that I put a episode out earlier this year in January. That was more of just a get off your butt and do an episode. This one is my first official episode that I'm counting for the year. But if you're new here, my name is Matt Lawson. I'm a licensed professional counselor, coach, and educator. This podcast exists for one simple reason: to help you move from confusion to clarity as you prepare for licensure and stepping into a career in the mental health profession. I'm really excited for this year, folks. There are some really great changes coming to the podcast that I think is going to just help more people. Let me just share with you what I have planned for this year. First, if you've been listening, you've heard me mention that Licensure Concierge app is up and is a resource, and it's going. I've had some good feedback already with the purchases that have gone through that. It's looking really good so far. I am regularly working on updates to it, and I'm hoping to add new features to it this year as well. But it really is helping a lot of people just track their hours and their continuing education, and that's really what I wanted to do at baseline with this app. And please check it out. The link will be in the show notes, so you can take a look. Next up, I have been working on building more of a community, an online community for Licensure Lifeline. So this is something that has been asked for and talked about really since the show started. But I've had many people write in asking, like, are there any resources online? Are there any study groups online? Do I provide any type of coaching around studying? And this is something that I'm hoping will answer a lot of these questions. This is going to be an online group where you can get into it, get a subscription, meet other individuals that are studying for the test. I'll be hosting things like study groups. I'll be hosting little online courses, very similar to what I do in the podcast. But I'm going to make it a resource for people that are both studying and starting their career in mental health. But I will definitely get into more details as I get closer to being done with this. I'm hoping to launch it next month, and you'll have links and all that stuff once it's up and going. Also, the podcast is going to be evolving. I really like the format of the podcast. I've gotten really good feedback about the format of the podcast. I want to make it more almost like a masterclass, where you really are taking deeper dives into some of these topics. It's not going to take away from what I've been doing here. I'm still going to have multiple choice questions and go over vignettes and things like that. But I'm going to give more details on topics. This also means that the episodes are probably going to be a little bit longer. and I'm going to be releasing probably on a bi-weekly cadence, just to give me enough time to really put these episodes together the way I want to. But the core of the show is not going to change. I'm just going to add more. And with that adding more, I'm also going to create something where if people want to opt into like a longer show, I'm going to offer some type of subscription, probably through something like Patreon, where you can get longer episodes um, for a subscription. And the last thing here, I'm working on a book. Many of you have heard me talk about, like tech in the industry and things like that, and that is what the book is going to be about. I'm really interested in this area, the melding of psychology and technology. So, it's something that's very near and dear to me, something I've been doing a lot of research on. But that will be out this summer, and as again that gets closer, I'll give you more information on that as well. So lots of stuff going on this year. I'm excited for the podcast. It really has just amazed me how much this has evolved, and just the feedback that I get is so great. And I want to thank everybody for hanging with me. I'm really hoping that people are getting a lot out of this and just nailing those tests. I know how nerve wracking it was and has been over the years for me to take those tests, and I hope, if anything, this just provides some level of comfort. So on to this episode. We're talking Freud today. So I'm going to start the beginning of the year, going back to some of the main theorists in the field. Of course, I'm going to kick things off with Freud. So that is going to be the main topic today. But before we get into that, let's go into the news. I originally heard this story on NPR, but it was really interesting. Some of the reports that are coming out, some of the statistics that are coming out around how teens are using chatbots, but more and more are increasingly using AI chatbots as part of their emotional support, with both positive engagement and serious concerns emerging, right? Recent surveys found that more than 1 in 8 adolescents and young adults used AI chatbots for mental health advice, and many users report engaging with them at least monthly. At the same time, psychologists and safety advocates are warning that these tools can create emotional dependence and reinforce unhelpful thinking patterns because they mimic relational responses without true clinical grounding. That is one of the aspects of using chatbots the way it's being talked about here. Is the chatbot, they're the algorithms that they are based on meld to the person that is using them, right? So, they learn, they understand, they start to understand your patterns, they understand the way you talk, the way you think, what you need. Like the LLM is looking to please you, and it'll say and do things that it thinks is pleasing you. And I put things in quotation marks. Um, but it doesn't necessarily have a good grounding in sound mental health support. So again, something to really look for, especially if you are considering working with teens and adolescents. They have this convenient way now that they're being brought up around to get advice that has very low barriers to entry for them, right? There's not really any emotional or psychological concern that they're going to be judged by talking to these things. So it makes it that much easier for them to talk. And right now, we're looking at chatbots that are at a level that can give seemingly emotional support. That's false, right? I mean, it's not real emotional support. It's just what it thinks emotional support looks like. So it becomes a really important conversation to have with teens and young adults, just around where they're getting their advice, what they're talking to learn about some of these things. Definitely something to keep on your radar. Okay, from the tech world, let's go take a look at just the some trends in the professional life of a mental health therapist. So there's been a really striking analysis that highlights the broader healthcare workforce crisis that continues to impact patient care, including behavioral health services. So we're seeing, significant shortages in healthcare in general, but even more so in behavior health. And we're seeing a lot of policies around financial support for behavioral health just being cut right and left. It's interesting, like especially like at a lot of the schools in my area, they don't have counselors on site anymore. They don't have school counselors, and it's one of those things that just gets so frustrating to see, especially after some type of tragedy at a school. The first thing they do is talk about how this is a mental health issue and how kids need more mental health support. Yet we're seeing these trends where they're just cutting funding for mental health services. So, just talking toward advocacy, we need to advocate for ourselves. We need to advocate for our communities, and find ways to provide this support that is always needed. All right, let's get into the main topic today, Sigmund Freud. So, it doesn't matter what your modality is. In modalities, most of us are become pretty eclectic anyway. Like you pull things from a bunch of different modalities, and psychoanalysis is no different. I know very few individuals that are pure psychoanalysts, that are pure utilizers of CBT, ACT, DBT. Everybody kind of draws from everything. So, Freud does like these pieces that he came up with, even though some of them are very out of date and just misinformed. The relevancy of what he did and what psychoanalysis continues to be is extremely relevant in modern times. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist, so he got his start in medicine, right? He practiced in the late 1800s and early 1900s. At the time, medicine focused almost entirely on physical explanations for illness, right? There was no sense that there was something going on in the brain that could be impacting the rest of the body. So psychology was suffering just poorly. Like it was just doing poorly. People that exhibited psychological issues were oftentimes just institutionalized. They were taken and put away from society, so they couldn't cause problems. But Freud proposed that much of human behavior is driven by unconscious processes, meaning that people are influenced by thoughts, memories, conflicts, motivations they're not consciously aware of all the time. And just that statement, right? I mean, it just seems so like now today, it's just like, yeah, of course. Like our thoughts, our memories, conflicts in the past impact us. And there's, could have this underlying effect. But this wasn't necessarily a thing back when Freud started practicing. So if you remember nothing else about Freud for the exams, remember this. Freud equals unconscious motivation plus early childhood plus internal conflict. Those are his things. So they're his pillars that just really underline psychoanalysis. Freud first described the mind using what he called the topographical model. This model divides in from awareness into three different levels. So I'm sure you've seen that picture of the iceberg, and so you have like the conscious mind, and that's above the water. This is what we're actively aware of, the thoughts, the feelings, perceptions happening right now. Then the preconscious mind, just below the surface, information you're not thinking about currently, but you can easily access, memories, learned information, and in like stored knowledge, right? Then you have the unconscious mind. This is way deep underwater, and that iceberg model. This is Freud's most influential contribution. The unconscious contains repressed memories, unresolved traumas, unacceptable impulses, and internal conflicts. Freud believed psychological symptoms often develop when unconscious material tries to surface but is blocked by psychological defenses. It's pretty wild, right? So Freud thought that there was this conflict going on a lot of the times within our brains where these things that were pushed deep down were trying to resurface, reclaim attention, but psychological defenses are keeping them at bay, that forming walls, forming defenses around them. So think about this, like a clinical example of this. A client develops unexplained anxiety around authority figures. Through therapy, they discover unresolved fear and anger toward a critical parent. Freud would say that the anxiety is not random, but it is symbolic of an unresolved unconscious conflict. So the reason this individual has issues with authority figures was because they had potentially an authoritarian parent in their life. And even though that's not a conscious thought for them, even that this might be say they may say something like, "Yeah, I have no idea why I have issues with authority." Um, being able to explore that and exploring like how they were raised and what parents were like around them, like stuff like this can come out. A little tip for the exam: if a question mentions hidden motivations, symbolic patterns, or repressed experiences, Freud's usually the answer. But let's move on to another really significant area for Freud, the structural model. So, this is the id, the ego, and the superego. Freud later expanded his theory into what is called the structural model of personality. This is one of the most tested Freudian concepts that you'll see on the exam. So, first off, you have the id. ID. This is that primitive, instinctual part of the personality present from birth. It operates on pleasure principles. The id wants immediate gratification of needs such as hunger, sex, aggression, and comfort. It does not consider logic, consequences, or morality. So, an example here: a toddler screams because they want a toy immediately, operating primarily from the id. So, yeah, like id, really young, just acting on instinct, you know, going to the most animalistic way of getting things done in your life. The superego. This represents internalized moral standards, social expectations, and conscientiousness. It develops through parental and cultural influences. The superego strives for perfection and can produce guilt or shame. I always remembered this one. I would envision Superman um, saving society, like that's social expectations. So Superman has that, is grounded in social expectations, social standards. That's one of the ways I always remembered this. But an example might be a client feeling intense guilt or having angry thoughts toward a loved one. That reflects superego influences. Last one here is the ego. This is the mediator between the id and the superego, and the reality of the world. It operates on the reality principle. The ego attempts to satisfy the id's desires in a socially acceptable way while managing the superego's expectation. So the ego is the referee, right? And I always thought about that, like a referee that has ego written across the front, the referee between the superego and the id. Clinical application here: most psychological distress, according to Freud, occurs when the ego becomes overwhelmed trying to manage the id and the superego. Next up with Freud, we have defense mechanisms. This is another really big one for him. So Freud believed when internal conflicts becomes overwhelming, the ego uses defense mechanisms to reduce anxiety. Defense mechanisms are unconscious strategies that distort reality to protect the individual from emotional distress. These are extremely high yield exam topics. Um, there's a lot about defense mechanisms that I've seen on the test. So first up, you have repression. So pushing the distressing memories out of conscious awareness. An example of this is a client who has no memory of early childhood trauma. They've repressed that memory. Projection attributes one unacceptable feeling to someone else. So a client may project something like hostility toward their partner, accusing their partner of being angry or aggressive. So, you know, I'm sorry, a client that feels hostile toward their partner may accuse them of being angry or aggressive. Displacement. This is redirecting emotional responses from the original source to a safer target. An example: yelling at a family member after being criticized by a boss. So I'm sure you've heard that phrase, we hurt the ones that we love. This is a perfect example of displacement. Um, People tend to feel more comfortable around loved ones, and it's easier for them to yell at, let's say, a family member where they already know what the consequences are versus yelling at a boss that has wronged them, where their consequence may be getting fired and losing their income. So that's displacement. Reaction formation, expressing the opposite of one's true feelings. So treating someone with exaggerated kindness when harboring resentment. Rationalization, that's creating a logical explanation to justify unacceptable behavior. That's an easy one. And it kind of says what it does, right? You rationalize. Denial is the next one here, another really easy one, refusing to acknowledge reality or distressing facts. This is something that's kind of nice. You see things like denial and rationalization, because they're so upfront. They kind of do what they say. It is like it helps you be a little bit more strategic with what you need to memorize and learn. You can already like kind of check those off as like got those. Okay, let's get into psychosexual development. So, Freud believed personality develops through 5 stages of childhood focused on pleasure seeking zones. First up, you have the oral stage, birth to 1 years old, right? This is, the focus on this is mouth and feeding, potential fixations that occur here, word dependency, substance use, overeating, and nail biting. I remember studying these in grad school. And I hadn't really thought about it up to this point. I don't know why I would. I guess I'd never really even heard of these stages, psychosexual stages, until grad school. But if you think about like fetishes and things like that, it's really interesting to kind of consider, how fetishes develop in individuals, and when you kind of consider like the psychosexual stages, it was something that I hadn't really thought about. And definitely, like, I had a couple of friends that were getting into sex therapy when we were in grad school, and it was just really interesting discussions around these things and the psychosexual stages. um, so next stage here, anal stage, ages 1 to 3 years old. Focused around this is toilet training, control, potential fixations, anal retentive, right? Rigid, perfectionist, controlling, anal explosive, messy, disorganized, impulsive. Next up, phallic stage, ages 3 to 6 years. Focus on genital awareness and identification with same sex partner. Freud proposed the Oedipus and the Electra complex during this stage as conflicts. Next up, you have the latency stage, ages 6 to puberty. So this focused on social and academic skill development. Sexual impulses are relatively dormant for the most part at this stage. Then the genital stage is adolescence and adulthood, mature relationships and sexuality development. Good exam memory here. Think OAPLG, opal, large, oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital, OAPLG. All right. Next up, transference and countertransference. These two things always kind of messed with me. So I'm hoping I can give you some tips here to remember them. So transference occurs when a client unconsciously redirects feelings from past relationships onto their therapist. An example might be a client begins viewing the therapist as a parental figure and reacts emotionally based on that history. Countertransference occurs when the therapist projects their own unresolved emotions onto the client. So, example, a therapist becomes overly protective of a client who reminds them of a younger sibling. The thing that I use to remember this is the countertransference. I always imagined the therapist behind a counter projecting their unresolved emotion onto the client. So think about like a therapist standing behind a fast food counter and projecting their stuff onto somebody else. Okay. All right. So in modern therapy, we see, in psychoanalysis has evolved from the time of Freud, right? We have modern psychoanalysts, and so you still see a lot of some of the main tenets like understanding childhood trauma and exploring unconscious relationship patterns and recognizing defense mechanisms. That those are things that have been kind of stayed in the psychoanalysis arena, and that we can use as exploratory tools with individuals today. So again, like these concepts are definitely from, or the roots of these concepts are from a time where we were just starting to understand things, but they their evolution really does allow us for some really in-depth conversation with the people that we're trying to support just around these certain areas. Let's get into some multiple choice questions. So, question one. A client frequently expresses intense anger towards their supervisor, but reports being unable to confront them. Instead, the client reports becoming irritated and yelling at their family after work. Which Freudian defense mechanisms best explains this behavior? Is this projection, reaction formation, displacement, or repression? The correct answer is C, displacement. So displacement occurs when an emotional energy is redirected from the original source of the distress to a safer, less threatening source. Remember? In this case, the client cannot safely express anger toward their supervisor, but they do feel comfortable expressing it toward their family member. Um, Next up. According to Freud's structural model of personality, which component operates on the reality principle? Is that the id, the ego, the superego, or preconsciousness? The answer here is going to be ego. The ego balances the desire of the id with the moral expectations of the superego. Remember, ego is the referee. EGO in a referee shirt with ego right across the chest. Consider real world consequences. The ego functions on the reality principle, attempting to meet the needs in the socially acceptable and realistic ways. Question number 3. A therapist notices feelings unusually protective of a client who reminds them of their younger siblings. This is best described as transference, countertransference, projection, or identification. Countertransference, right? So remember, therapists standing behind the counter, pushing their stuff onto the clients, projecting their stuff onto the clients. So projecting their unresolved emotional reactions onto a client. The therapist's emotional response is based on personal experiences rather than client's behavior alone. Next question. Freud believed that adult personality traits are significantly shaped by unresolved conflict occurring during early childhood developmental stages. This belief reflects Freud's emphasis on behavioral conditioning, humanistic self actualization, psychosexual development, or cognitive restructuring. You know this one, psychosexual development. Freud believed personality develops through psychosexual stages, unresolved conflicts, or fixations during these stages. They influence adults' personality traits and psychological functioning. All right, question number 5. A client reports having no memory of repeated childhood abuse despite documentations confirming it occurred. Freud would most likely explain this phenomenon as denial, repression, rationalization, or sublimation. The answer to this one is going to be repression. Repression involves unconsciously blocking distressing memories or impulses from conscious awareness. Freud viewed repression as a central defense mechanism protecting individuals from overwhelming psychological pain. Last question. During therapy, a client begins viewing the therapist as a critical authority figure similar to their parents and responds with fear and defensiveness. Freud would describe this as projection, countertransference, transference, or resistance. Answer to this one's going to be transference, right? Transference occurs when a client unconsciously transfers feelings and expectations from a past relationship onto the therapist. This is a central concept in psychodynamic therapy and often becomes material in therapeutic exploration. All right, folks, this is what you can expect from the episodes moving forward. They're going to be longer. I'm going to give you more information, go just deeper into the topics And like I said, I'm going to have that option for even longer episodes eventually, that you'll be able to access. So, I'm really hoping that this is going to be something that just, again, helps just more people. But let's wrap up with Freud today. Just kind of stepping back and really looking at the material that was covered. Freud fundamentally changed how we understand human behavior, right? He introduced the idea that our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are influenced by unconscious processes, early childhood experiences, and internal psychological conflicts. Those concepts continue to shape modern therapy, even in approaches that moved away from traditional psychoanalysis. Today, we really got into Freud's major contributions, including the structure of personality through the id, the ego, and the superego, the role of defense mechanisms in managing things like anxiety. We got into psychosexual development stages and powerful clinical concepts of transference and countertransference. For exam preparation, remember the big anchors. Freud is almost always connected to unconscious motivation, early development, developmental influences, and internal conflict between competing psychological forces. For clinical practice, Freud reminds us that symptoms often carry meaning. When clients present with repeated relational patterns, intense emotional reactions, or behaviors that seem confusing or contradictory, it is often worth exploring what unconscious story might be shaping their experience in life. Understanding this theory is not about memorizing historical figure, right? It's about developing a framework of understanding human behavior with depth, curiosity, and clinical intentionality. As we move through this year, we're going to continue to building on these masterclass type podcast, and I'm really again hoping that these foundational concepts can help you pass the test and start shaping your professional life. Thank you again for spending this time with me today. And as always, until next time, keep learning.